Okay, in this fourth video about research design tasks, I'm just going to briefly talk about formulating questions to ask of each case, and then I'm going to summarize by talking about 10 common flaws or challenges in case study research designs. So the final task, after you've selected your cases, is to formulate some questions for each of your cases. And there are two kinds of questions, general kinds of questions that you should ask. One is just questions to establish the values of the variables. What are the questions that help me measure the independent variables and the dependent variable? And I'm going to ask those questions of each case, and you might adapt them a little bit to each case so you can measure the case in the context of the case. The second kind of question you want to ask is about what I call diagnostic evidence. This is evidence not about the values of the variables, but about the processes that through time create events and sequences in the case that lead up to the outcome that you observe. So this is the evidence that we're going to take up with process tracing. It's not evidence that does comparisons of the values of the variables. It's evidence that looks at the processes one case at a time, the evidence about mechanisms. So we might even go to the step of, as we identify what are the things that I will look for that will tell me if it's this process or that process that's operating, I might even go to the step of say, how likely, if the evidence turns out this way, how likely is it that that was the process or this was the process? Or if it turns out that way, if the value on that diagnostic evidence is this, how likely is it that was this process or that one? We'll go into that in much more detail when we talk about Bayesian process tracing, but we can actually formalize what we call the likelihood or the likelihood ratios. How likely is this evidence, this diagnostic evidence, if this explanation is true or if that one is true. Okay, let me sum up by looking at 10 common challenges or flaws in case study research designs. I've read thousands of case study research designs. I've reviewed them for places like the National Science Foundation in the United States or the U.S. Institute of Peace, or for the many, many classes on case study methods I've taught over the last 3 decades. So one common problem is when somebody hasn't done their homework and they haven't situated their puzzle and their question within the existing research. Often people will claim that there's a gap in the literature, and we're looking for that gap in the literature that we can fill by our research, and that's what we should be doing. But we don't want to exaggerate the gap in the literature, and we don't want to misidentify what's the really interesting gap here. Remember, often the people who are reviewing your article for a journal, they probably think they wrote the literature on this, and they'll be upset if you ignore their literature, don't cite it, and don't identify that, well, it's not that nobody's ever thought about anything like this. It's like, here's this precise version of this that nobody's actually researched or addressed. So make sure you've done your homework. Think about what's the closest literature to this, whether it's the regional literature or the functional literature or the theoretical literature. What's the closest people have come to studying my cases? Maybe they studied this case, but for slightly different reasons, right? Identify the literatures that are closest to your case and your question, and situate your question relative to those literatures. Which parts of the literatures are you going to build on? Which ones are you going to push back against or argue against? Which ones you're going to test, draw on explicitly for your alternative hypotheses. Be very clear about those issues and do your homework. The second one is if there's problems in the case selection, if there's some obvious selection bias or selection effects. If I, as a reviewer, think that I can come up with better case selection for your puzzle than the selection you're giving me, that's a problem. Now, I could be wrong. It could be that there are very good reasons that you set aside these other cases that you could have studied. They could be pragmatic reasons that you don't have access to that evidence or you don't speak those languages or whatever else. I get that, right? But if I, as a reviewer, or if you keep talking to people and they say, well, why aren't you studying this case? Well, you need to give an answer in your research of why you're not studying that case. A lot of times people don't give a very good justification for case selection at all. A little bit better is they'll give some justification like the 13 criteria I gave you, but they'll only talk about the cases they chose. Even better is, I chose these cases for these reasons, for this particular research design. Here are the other cases I almost chose. Here's why I didn't choose them. Even if that's in a footnote, you've already addressed and preempted that reviewer or critic who says, you should have studied this case. Why didn't you study that case? Well, here's the reason, right? The third is if you've overlooked possible endogeneity. or reciprocal feedback effects, this one variant of endogeneity. Let me give you an example, interesting example here, and you could probably think of lots of your own. Every so often there will be a newspaper article that tells about a medical study that finds that people who engage in sexual relations more often are also healthier and live longer. And the implicit theory, or sometimes the explicit theory there, is that engaging in sexual relations is a form of exercise. Exercise is good for your health and for living a long life, and therefore the frequency of sexual relations leads to a long and healthy life, right? Well, whenever you come up with an argument, try just reversing the argument to test for potential endogeneity. So here, if people aren't feeling healthy, they don't feel like engaging in sexual relations. When you're sick, you don't feel like doing that kind of thing or any other kind of exercise, right? So there's, causal arrows in both directions. And now the question is, how can we sort out, which way the causation is going here? Or maybe sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. It doesn't have to be only one or the other. But we want to think about that question. If as a reviewer, I can see that you've ignored potential endogeneity, I can tell you, hey, you got a problem here, go out and fix that. But I've already lost some confidence that you know what you're doing because you gave me a research design with an obvious endogeneity problem. So you may not know how to fix the endogeneity perfectly. That's a big challenge. But you got to at least identify, I understand that this is a challenge for my research. Here's the best way I can think of addressing it. That's much more convincing to a reviewer than being ignorant that that's a real problem for your research. A fourth is if you don't pay enough attention to alternative explanations. Your reviewer probably has some favorite explanation you've left out. This is again why I urge that you cast the net widely and at least leave some footnotes saying, here's a common explanation in the literature. Here's why I don't think it applies to this case. Here's this evidence that was strong enough that I'm not going to use a lot of my time going into that explanation in detail. Done, right? But if you leave it out entirely, your reviewer is going to say, this is terrible. You've left out an obvious explanation. Let's reject this article. We're not going to publish this, right? So make sure you've thought widely about the explanations. Make sure you've been fair to them, because the explanation you just dismissed may be the one that the reviewer likes or used to like. You have to be able to convince them why it's not a good explanation for your case. If you've overlooked various kinds of complexity, path dependency, high order interactions, and so on, if you start out thinking of possible complexity, it may prove that the problem is really pretty simple. But if you start out assuming simplicity, you may miss some complexity in what's going on in your phenomena. So at least entertain the possibility of these different kinds of complexity. Ask yourself, how would I know if that's going on? How would I prove that that's the relationship that's going on here? If there's a mismatch of the concepts and the measures, bad measurement. I gave an earlier example in an earlier video where somebody used violent regime deaths as a measure of democracy. It's a terrible measure of democracy. So you want to be good about actually getting and measuring as best you can the concept as you've articulated the concept in your theory. You can't always do that perfectly, but you want to show that you've done as good a job as you can, or as good a job as can be expected. If you fail to anticipate learning from earlier cases to later ones, this is one of those forms of complexity. So if you set that aside entirely, if you didn't notice that what happened in the early Arab Spring cases affected the behavior and outcomes in the later ones, that's a deal breaker for me as a reviewer, right? Reviewers are looking for a reason not to approve an article or to give funding because they're getting 10 and 12 articles for every one they can approve, or 10 or 12 funding grant proposals for every one they can approve. So they're just looking for reasons to set aside your research proposal. Don't give them a reason to do that by having weak methods. Failure to address differences in a most similar case design or similarities in least similar ones. This is a predictable challenge you'll get, so just address it preemptively. Here are the other things that are different between these most similar cases. Here's why those don't generate the difference in the outcome. Just address it up front. If the process tracing is not thorough, if it's not equal or fair to the alternative explanations, your reviewer is going to sense that. So don't pick favorites. That's not the business of research. The business of research is finding out what's true as best we can. And there's no reason to pick favorites. You don't have to pick favorites. You don't want to pick favorites. You want to go where the evidence leads you, and you want to do the process tracing in a thorough fashion. Finally, problems of generalization. If somebody overgeneralizes, makes some huge sweeping claim about the mechanisms or processes applying to vastly heterogeneous populations, I'm going to be skeptical of that. Or if they have some basis for making a generalization and they don't, that's less common. Authors usually overclaim or exaggerate generalizability, but sometimes they neglect the opportunity to generalize. There's a great article by I think it's Suzanne Herman in World Politics, where she goes through a very detailed case study of the fall of the Berlin Wall and how it was the result of an information cascade, that the more people got out in the streets, the safer it was to get out in the streets to protest, the more likely it was the protest would succeed. And so it built on itself. But she doesn't talk about the conditions under which the information cascades will or will not take off. And if she had addressed that, and in her other work, she's very good about addressing the question of generalization. If she had addressed that, she would have anticipated some of the dynamics of the Arab Spring almost 20 years later. So think about the question of generalization. Don't overclaim, but make as strong a claim as is justifiable given the evidence from your cases. Okay, so final exercise here. Think about how each of these 10 flaws or challenges might apply to the research puzzles you've posed about the COVID pandemic, right? Which things do you really have to worry about? How might you address some of these research challenges in the context of your proposed ideas about researching COVID? So take some time to think about that, enter in some ideas in the Google Doc if you're taking a class with me. All right.